going into my doctorate, I felt as another sort of hurdle. Again, it's sort of figuring out like, well, I spent all this time researching Takamitsu and learning about his sort of rediscovery of his own heritage, his own culture, his own identity. And then it kind of clicked with me. It's like, well, maybe I should probably follow suit. Maybe I should also navigate a similar trajectory where I'm trying to discover now how my identity plays a role into my creative output, because it's for Takamitsu, I always like to argue that it was always there. Takamitsu was very much sort of against his own sort of Japanese culture, which made sense for a sort of post-World War II Japanese musician. But for me, I was thinking like, do I ever feel like my identity actually really did come through at any point? And for me, the answer was always no. It's like, actually, I don't really recall feeling like I was at least conscious or aware of the fact that things like my interests, my background, my heritage, so on and so forth, could play a role in this creative medium.
This is Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast from Loose Leaf Transmissions. Hey there, y'all, and welcome to another edition of the podcast. If you are new here, my name is Tyler. I'm a composer, a broadcaster, curator, producer, do a lot of different things, and I love to sit down with other creative people to explore how they make their work and what drives them to create. And if you have been listening for a while, well, welcome back. I'm glad to have you along again. On this episode of Music Maker, I'm joined by composer Michael Frazier. Michael is a Black and Latino composer who teaches composition at Oberlin Conservatory. His work draws deeply from Black creative traditions, blending jazz, birdsong, hip-hop, and improvisation into a language that's harmonically rich, rhythmically fluid, and deeply personal. His music has been performed by ensembles like Strings and Hammers, OSSIA New Music, Detroit Chamber Winds and Strings, and many others. In this conversation, Michael reflects on how embracing his cultural identity became central to his creative voice. We also talk about the role of jazz in shaping his sense of musical time, how his approach to harmony and gesture creates emotional resonance, and how growing as an artist ultimately meant learning to write music that felt fully authentic to who he is. I've known Michael for quite a long time. We both went to the University of South Florida where we studied composition together. And it's been quite some time since I've had a chance to sit down and talk with Michael. So this is also a bit of a catching up episode, and I just really can't wait to share this conversation with you. We'll get into it in just a moment. This show grows because of people like you, not some algorithm. So if something in today's conversation sparks something for you, the best way to support it is to follow the podcast and to share it with someone who'd get it too. You'll find links to subscribe, follow us on Instagram, or support on Patreon, all in the show notes or at looseleaftransmissions.com. Now, on to my conversation with Michael Frazier. Michael, just before we got on this call, I was talking with my wife and our mutual classmate, I guess, Susanna Hancock, who you kind of went through USF together. And we were kind of like, oh, we actually haven't talked to Michael in a while. So, I think it's been a good 10 years since our paths actually crossed. And I'm just really excited to hear all the stuff before USF that I don't know about, and then kind of what's happened since, because we were only there together for about a year. So just really looking forward to this, and thanks so much for your time today.
Definitely, Tyler. Thank you for having me. It's really special and always fun to sort of reconnect with old colleagues and sort of catch up so many years later. I can't believe it's been 10 years actually. When you say, I was like, oh my gosh, it actually has been a decade. Whoa, what happened?
It doesn't feel like it, but it feels like it. It's wild. So, with all that said, where we like to start here on Music Maker is really as far back as you can remember, or as far back as you're willing to share as it pertains to your artistic journey. So what would you say is your earliest artistic memory as a composer?
That's a great question, because I actually always remember this one fond memory I have actually from elementary school. And honestly, this is so sort of separate from my journey later, throughout high school. But actually in elementary school, I vividly remember that, as I think as a first grader, let's say, or whatever it was, my sort of music program at the elementary school had this sort of thing where, we're all learning how to play recorder,
Mm.
as we all do, at least
Right, right.
in the Florida education system, learning how to play recorder. And I got by without learning how to read music actually for quite a while. I don't know how long. It was like I was kind of just making things up or basically playing by ear, and sort of like learning tunes that we were playing, and basically there'd be kind of like checkpoints every so often where it's like, okay, to get like your next like colored bead in your like level, like you have to play this tune, it's like a 30-second, whatever it is. And I remember one morning I was like, oh man, I didn't practice for this. So I had my friend play me the tune and I just memorized it just then and there. I was like, okay, I'll play that for them.
Yeah, yeah.
I get the sheet music and all that. Again, I don't know how to read music, and I get to my little like performance thing, and I'm playing, of course, this thing that I memorized, which is not at all what was on the sheet music itself. So she stops me and she's like, oh, what are you playing? And I was like, I'm playing this, I thought, and long story short, at that point, I ended up realizing that maybe I should actually learn how to read music, do this properly, go through the actual process. Of course, it's a recorder, so it didn't take me that long to kind of like figure out what I was actually doing. But as it pertains to composition, one of the last like two levels of this kind of like trajectory was to actually compose your own little miniature piece. And I recall being the first one in that class to actually get that far. So I started from not being able to read music at all, again, as like a 6, 7 year old, whatever it was, into actually composing, this 30-second to 60-second little recorder thing in an effort to get that silver or gold beat, whatever it was. So I remember feeling quite proud and happy that I sort of overcame things in that regard. But I think it was since then I've been pretty much engaged and enthralled with music just in general. But it honestly wouldn't be until high school where I sort of reapproached composition again, sort of as you positioned the question. So from elementary school all the way to high school, I was involved with music, but in terms of composing, after that fateful day of getting that bead, it really took me quite a while before I was like, this seems like a fun thing to do. Like, how about I give it a try?
What was that recorder piece like? I mean, hearing you describe like, okay, you couldn't read the music, and then you got so on top of it that you were the first one to like compose a piece. Were you actually writing it down, or were you like just kind of improvising and remembering what you played? I mean, what was that little piece like?
Oh man, I wish I could remember all the details, but I do remember that it was actually written down, like actually
Okay,
properly
yeah,
notated, with whatever kind of 7-year-old penmanship I would have had back then. Again, very, very brief and almost certainly influenced or informed by whatever I was learning at the time, these little tunes that they teach kids and stuff. But yeah, I wish I still had that, maybe my teacher from back then still has it,
right.
in her older age now, like maybe she has it framed somewhere, I don't know.
Yeah, bring it back into like a new piece, and yeah.
Yeah, right. I would. That would be
um,
something fun.
so you didn't really compose at all from that moment until sometime in high school. So if the recorder moment was your earliest memory, I mean, I guess, what would you say is your most meaningful first memory as a composer? Like the moments where you're like actually putting music down on a page with the intent of either playing it yourself or having other people play it.
Yeah, actually, in high school, I discovered the software Finale. Back then, it was I had Finale Notepad, the free one, and you know, in high school, because I had gotten so used to playing so many different woodwinds, I was playing in all the bands. I was in marching band, jazz band. I mean, my experience and influence with different forms of wind music actually had me sort of enthusiastic about like, hey, what if I write my own piece actually? But funny enough, actually, the first things that I wrote were for solo piano. I was also teaching myself piano, at least how to read sort of piano using kind of like sort of understand the mechanisms of it. I've never had like piano lessons or anything, but my first little pieces in Finale were for solo piano, and they're very much influenced by like Debussy and Chopin, and nothing overly complex or virtuoso. It was really just kind of like, let me try these things out that I was sort of hearing in context, and see sort of what I can do with them, and honestly, not even imagining that somebody might ever look at this or play it.
Yeah.
In fact, I only ever shared it with, besides like my grandma, I never shared it with anybody else besides my high school band teacher. I sent him these little things, and I don't think I ever got like an email reply from him. Maybe I sent him the
Oh
wrong
no.
email, but he was aware that I was doing it, and he seemed like very much like encouraging, like, yeah, keep doing that. It seems like a great thing, go on with it. But yeah, it was interesting because I don't recall writing really any wind music music at all until maybe I got to college actually. But despite me being like a big wind player, doing all these things, yeah, my first little things, and again, it went with access to finality, was just for piano, and it was just because it was fun to do. It was like, let me kind of like creatively flow all of my ideas into this like one sort of medium, just for practice, for enjoyment, and I'd say largely for myself.
Yeah, it was like kind of separated from your like playing in band, all that stuff. Like they were two very different things for you at that point.
Totally, totally.
Yeah. Just out of curiosity, I mean, you said you shared it with your band director. That makes sense, but why only your grandma?
Oh well, I'm sure my mom also saw it at some point, but I actually grew up most with my grandma. Actually, my mom wasn't around until I think like maybe like later in middle school. But I think I recall mostly hearing it to my grandma because of my mom being busy with work and such. She was a single parent, that sort of thing. But my mom for sure was definitely involved in my musical life. She was at all my
Yeah.
concerts, always taking photos, etc. So yeah, I think it was just about availability at the time when it happened. Then
Yeah,
maybe I
yeah,
just
yeah.
forgot about it and moved on.
Yeah, I wasn't sure like if like your this person was just like the only musician in your family and like the only person you could turn to or, you know.
No, in fact, as you pointed out, as far as I know, I am the only person in my family who is musically oriented. In fact, on my dad's side is full of like athletes, and frankly, I probably could have and should have been an athlete in some
Yeah.
timeline. But yeah, and somebody actually, I think this recently, I don't know who it was, but somebody asked me, like, oh, is your family musical? And I was like, no, actually, like, I'm the only person who actually like went this far, and just I can't think of any other person who even got involved in music in any regard, whether it's sort of just for fun, for practice, whatever it is. Certainly not for getting a multiple degrees in it.
Right, right. Same. Yeah, and you're reminding me of like when I was in middle school and very much into like middle school band and the middle school football coach trying to get me who was like a I guess like what you'd call like a husky boy, I was like taller than everyone else and like kind of chunky. And he like tried to get me to join the football team and I was like, "No, I'm in band."
Yeah,
And
that
just
checks
like
out. Yeah,
yeah,
I've heard
yeah.
that before.
Yep, yep. So, when was your first encounter with a composer? Was that at some point in high school, or was that not until like you actually started college in Tampa?
I have to think about it. I really, in my early sort of mentality, I can't imagine having met any composer previously until I got to USF. Because again, I never considered myself a composer, nor did I consider it something that I would be doing in my life throughout high school. I was just kind of like, I like music, like period. So when I went to USF, it's not like I knew that I'd be a composer. I was just like, let me go here. In fact, I think I was more strongly leaning towards jazz. Like I
Mm,
would be a jazz performer, I
sure.
play saxophone in whatever context. But I'm sure that I have met composers at some point, or people who maybe worked for sort of wrote music for pedagogical reasons, maybe in high school. What I'm sure that I've encountered them, but at least in my most recent conscious, all I can think of is having met perhaps Paul Reller in Belgian or Saikon at USF. Like I think that would have been like the legitimate first time I actually met like actual living composers who are actively in the field, creating music, engaging with music in that regard. I would say it'd have to be them for sure.
I'll admit that I'm asking this question because again, my wife Susanna started at USF. You guys are in the same year, and I know her answer to this just by talking to her, like how she ended up being a composition major. How did you like decide to become a composition major? Like what was that process like? Is it something that you kind of came into school like, oh yeah, I'll do this, or like you said you were kind of interested in jazz. I mean, was the composition stuff just like, okay, like I'm going to just kind of do this on the side?
Yeah, this is a really easy question to answer because I tell this to my students all the time because I find it to be the funniest thing ever, honestly. Or it's humorous now looking back on it. But the literal only reason why I chose to be a composer, or let's say composition major at USF, was because during the advising session, the advisor speaking literally said to not pick composition as a degree track because you'll never make it, you'll never succeed. It's the hardest thing ever to
Oh
do. So
yeah,
I was like, bet, I'll do that. That sounds fun.
yeah, yeah.
So when I first started, I was like, I'll be a jazz double major, did a jazz and composition. But again, the choice for composition was really for me, and I don't even know why. Like there was no like hostility or it was like a challenge was presented. I was like, that sounds like fun. I'll do that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
So I recall just like, hey, I'm a composition major now, showing up to Paul Reller's classes, and and I guess maybe they didn't know or realize that I was doing this sort of thing. So I did have to kind of like actually apply with a portfolio, after a semester. It was very strange overall, and I'm happy that it worked out the way it did. But again, genuinely, there was like for me, no experience, no real thought into it, no investments, no like I see myself doing this sort of thing. Again, for me, it was just strictly like music, period, whatever it was. But for me to have been prompted with a challenge of saying like you wouldn't succeed in it, I guess was, at least for me back then, I felt strong enough to say like I'll give that a try and see what I can make of it.
Yeah, and then it became like the thing that you did.
Yeah, it is literally my livelihood, the thing I enjoy the most, teaching, especially as a sort of byproduct of it too. So I suppose it really worked out the best in the end.
Did you graduate as a double major like you started, or what prompted that shift where like you started taking composition more seriously over, not that you gave up any of the jazz stuff, but like, you ended up getting all your, your master's, your doctorate in composition. So,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It was, simply put, it really was a matter of just like investment, how much time I could actually invest into sort of like one thing that I was really focused on and really interested in. And I felt for like composition for me was sort of more, it was grasping me more. I felt like I really wanted to kind of involve myself more in that sort of territory of music. Of course, even though I dropped the jazz sort of major as a sort of credential sort of thing, for myself at least, I still played, and I especially would still listen to jazz sort of constantly. I still do. It's pretty much my favorite genre of music to this day. And as I've discovered over the course of my years of going through schooling and beyond, I've never like relinquished that sort of aspect of my musical sort of background. I just felt that earning a credential, and it was not something that I needed nor wanted, nor was it sort of really leading me towards where I wanted to be, like composition was.
Yeah. I'm curious because you're kind of describing like up until you started college as, you were just kind of almost, I don't want to say laissez-faire, but like composition was just the thing you did for fun. And I've talked to a few people who specifically studied with, Balgender at USF, and I've spoken to Balgender on the podcast as well. And it's very clear that like that it's a pretty rigorous kind of program for composers. So I mean, what was that like when you suddenly found yourself like getting this composition degree, having, done all this kind of just on the side for fun, and then suddenly it's like your whole academic life, more or less?
Yeah, it never felt really that rigorous or difficult or challenging, except in the scenarios where I had to kind of like learn or memorize things that I was certainly not familiar with. Certainly when I first got there, like if you had asked me to name any like even like 20th century composers, I would hesitate, be like I'd be like John Coltrane, like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's the first thing I would probably want to say.
Which
You know what I mean?
counts.
Which does count. Which I would argue now
Yeah,
that counts for sure, but as they would seek other answers,
yeah, of course.
which of course, we would know now. But no, yeah. So again, for me, I was so just unaware of really what an education in music composition was like that for me the rigor like wasn't really there. It was just like just do this sort of thing, and I was like,
Sure.
okay,
Yeah.
that's I guess what I'm in college to do this sort of thing. I'm aiming to get a degree in this. Who knows what'll happen afterwards, but at least for now, like this is what is expected of me, like just make it happen. So I got fairly used to just like the actual process with the expectations, the workload sort of thing. I remember back then especially, I would compose like 4 or 5 pieces a semester just because, like, yeah, I'll just throw all these things down because it was, again, a lot of fun. And I think perhaps the enthusiasm and the enjoyment of the process makes it feel less like work for me. That might be the answer. Certainly, once I got older, and especially in grad school, things shifted dramatically once I
Yeah.
became more focused into sort of like what I wanted to actually navigate with composition and such. But no, for sure, back then, again, me being starry eyed and having just zero awareness, I feel like maybe I was just like a blank canvas. They say like, yeah, just show me anything, I'll accept it and go with it. You know what I mean? Without really feeling like I had any place to sort of combat this. Like I'm the student, like just teach me how to do things. And I'm grateful for that. I would say I'm grateful for not having got into it with like this very grandiose expectation of what a composition or a composer would be. You know,
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I guess I should clarify, when I think about when I describe it as rigorous, I feel like to me I landed on that like many years after I graduated from USF in talking with like friends and peers and other composers who like went through other degree programs elsewhere where I'm like describing like, oh yeah, we did these juries and this career building exercises and all this kind of stuff. And they're like, what? Like you had to do what? And it was like very like, it was a little intense. Like the juries especially were a little intense
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. No kidding.
Yeah. So can you share a bit of an overview, maybe like connect the dots, so to speak, of your creative journey? I know that you went to Eastman after University of South Florida. I mean, to be fair, like as I ask this question more and more, it's like, what does conventional mean? What is unexpected? It's all subjective. But do you feel like you followed a more conventional path as a composer? Or do you feel like there were any unexpected twists along the way between, I don't know, let's just say the last 10 years, right?
Yeah, it's certainly both sort of convention and unexpected twist, as you put it. Both certainly happened. In fact, me even going to Eastman was an unexpected twist because I didn't know until like I think a month or maybe 5 weeks before the semester, like my last semester at USF was sort of concluding, right? But I think genuinely speaking, the journey that I had through grad school, from master's to doctorate, all the way through, felt overall very conventional. Like, I mean, the program at Eastman is, rigorous, certainly, just like it was at USF for obvious reasons. Bachelor, of course, went to Eastman and so on. And the sort of people that I met and the connections that I had and the classes that I took, everything, of course, was very, very much about sort of like the passion of like this sort of creative realm that we're all engaged with. But I felt like what was unexpected really was this sort of journey of self discovery that I had about what it was for me to be a composer, like what that means as for me as a like myself. I think it's important for everybody to have sort of their own definition for what music is, for what being a composer is, an artist, so on and so forth. But I struggled to find what that answer was for myself, especially as I entered Eastman. At first it was mostly just like the whole sort of imposter syndrome sort of thing, where it's like, like, oh man, why am I here? What am I doing here? And also like, what do I want to do here? That sort of thing. And I found that at least at first, in my first few years there, I gravitated towards what I really enjoyed listening to a lot. For example, my favorite composer of all time, I'd say, is Toru Takamitsu. People who know me know this answer, of course, so I won't get into it too wildly because I can go on forever about Takamitsu. But listening to his work, his variety of different works and different ensembles and configurations, it made me feel like I wanted to write music sort of like that, where things were a bit approachable in some sort of regards, whether it be harmonically or melodically, but really just sort of focus on aesthetics behind sort of just like the sonic environment itself. And for me, I was like, let me just like discover what this could be for me, like what it would be my own sort of harmonic language or sort of gestural language or environments that I focus mostly on just kind of like the gesture of music as opposed to anything else. That helps me sort of achieve like, okay, I could actually write music that I sort of want to do as opposed to being like assigned, like, hey, do this piece this semester as an assignment, right?
Yeah.
Or try like these techniques to sort of like learn how to grapple with 12 tone technique, minimalism, whatever it is. And of course, that led me into writing my master's thesis on Takamitsu. And going into my doctorate, I felt as another sort of hurdle. Again, is sort of figuring out like, well, I spent all this time researching Takamitsu and learning about his sort of rediscovery of his own heritage, his own culture, his own identity. And then it kind of clicked with me. It's like, well, maybe I should probably follow suit. Maybe I should also navigate a similar trajectory where I'm trying to discover now how my identity plays a role into my creative output, because it's for Takamitsu, I always like to argue that it was always there. Takamitsu was very much sort of against his own sort of Japanese culture, which made sense for a sort of post World War II Japanese musician. But for me, I was thinking like, do I ever feel like my identity actually really did come through at any point? And for me, the answer was always no. It's like, actually, I don't really recall feeling like I was at least conscious or aware of the fact that things like my interests, my background, my heritage, so on and so forth, could play a role in this creative medium, right? So once I got into the PhD program there and sort of was continuing on, is when I felt like I needed to start investing time into that sort of territory and sort of see what could become of this. Again, there was this question of like, what does it mean to be a composer for myself? Through that came a more sort of unapologetic use of jazz music as an influence in my creative output, allowing my harmonic language to be inspired by jazz, gestural writing, the inclusion of saxophones in music could be
Yeah,
another
yeah,
one.
right.
There was a lot of things that I was doing where I was like, I loved listening to jazz and also hip hop to an extent. I mean, there's certainly a lot of hip hop influence in there too, which in a way ties to jazz through sampling out of things, which we might get into later. But it was those sort of little stepping stones that helped me come to terms with the fact that me as a composer of color could very much rely and embrace identity as being part of my language, my musical language. Going throughout my doctoral program until I finished became mostly a journey of to what extent can I sort of like really embrace this and let it like kind of fulfill something gratifying from my musical output. It really wasn't until I'd say like my second year of my doctoral program where I felt like I actually really loved what I was writing. Like I was genuinely like, oh man, this like feels like me. This is working. I feel like happy and proud that I sort of came up with this, and I think it's because it felt the most sincere and genuine. Because I was again, I think finally aware, at least just very much aware of what I was sort of contributing as a composer of color.
I do have to say that I have similar feelings about Takamitsu, and I think you're the first composer I've talked with on the podcast for sure, but maybe in general, where it's like there's like an enthusiasm about Takamitsu.
Hmm.
Like for me, like when people ask me like who's my favorite composer, I tend that answer tends to change a lot naturally, like as you listen to different music and depending on the day. It's like I think it was Balgender who once said, like, I'd rather answer the question, like, what am I listening to right now? Right. Which I think is probably more of what people are asking. But for me, like, Takamitsu is like, he's on the pedestal for me, like, in my head to a degree that we went to Japan earlier this year. And I, like, had big plans to, like, do this pilgrimage to Takamitsu's grave. And I, like, researched where it was. And then, like, as you travel and you're on the ground, it's like, oh, don't have time to do that actually. So maybe one day
Right.
I'll get back. But you know, I I think it's interesting, and I have a lot of questions about like this, the way your identity shows up in your music that we're going to get to. But I think it's interesting that you describe your internal path. I mean, we have like an external path and an internal path, and maybe the external one's like it's on the surface what everyone would expect you to do, but then internally, as you said, like there was all these unexpected twists. And I mean, do you continue to think about these things? Even now, as you're like, you have a job, you're getting commissions, you're a professional composer. I mean, are you still thinking internally? Is that path still moving in some direction?
Very much so. It's sort of even not more difficult, more complex, I'd say, because not only am I sort of considering internally my identity with regard also to my Latino background. Again, a lot of the sort of earlier exploration of my identity was through me being black, but it's kind of like not really acknowledging me being also half Latino until more recently when I was like, maybe I should also tap into this as well. But so not only is it that kind of also journey rediscovery, which has also been really fulfilling and exciting, but also now because I have and have had students with all their own equal trajectories and journeys and sort of exploration of identity, it makes me even more aware of like, wow, I'm actually like at least influencing or letting them know that there's like this is an awareness of something you can actually sort of navigate and approach in your creative output like now. Like it took me so long to get to this point, but here you are like 18, 19, and I can sort of point to this and say like hey, don't forget that this could be like an aspect of your approach, not that it becomes like a conversational starter. I mean, some students come to me with those kind of feelings
Sure.
and thoughts, but it does feel sort of, I guess, exciting to sort of see that it results in such a breadth and variety of different musical outputs, as I've discovered from my students and my colleagues as well, that an awareness of identity at least is enough to kind of help sort of jettison creativity in a way which I would have, and it helps sort of influence me and keep me sort of refreshed about how like my own approach and sort of what I'm interested in doing as well.
Yeah. Hearing you talk about, how you treat this sort of stuff with your students. I mean, as you were kind of coming to grips with this for yourself, what was the response from your teachers and mentors as you were kind of grappling with this?
I feel like, thankfully, my the teachers that I've worked with, and especially at Eastman, they all felt very much sort of supportive and sort of enthusiastic. At worst, maybe they felt like just show me the end result sort of thing, right? Which is not even most of what it was. I mean, maybe that happened like once, but for the most part, there certainly wasn't a shared enthusiasm, and I believe it was. largely because they sort of like liked sort of seeing that I was really sort of gravitating towards something which felt more meaningful and sincere for me. Of course, teachers like Ricardo Zalmoldun, of course, is of course Latino. Carlos Sanchez Gutierrez also Latino, and it sort of helps to have those sort of
Yeah.
in my corner to help sort of say like, hey, yeah, you can absolutely do this. Here's examples of what we've done. You know what I mean? So again, it comes back to that idea of sort of awareness. You know, things my teachers for sure made me aware of things that helped me continue on this trajectory and feel like I was doing something that made sense, that would work musically, aesthetically, and that I shouldn't be sort of ashamed or sort of like trying to hide that was something that I was navigating. You know, I do, you know, to kind of like speak candidly, there's only one moment where I felt sort of like gently kind of frustrated, I would say. And it was actually with regard to, I was sharing a sort of a recording of this instrumental track by DJ Jay Dilla, hip hop DJ. I shared it with Carlos Sanchez Gutierrez, and I remember him feeling very much like this doesn't really sound that great. It's not that interesting, etc.
Yeah.
And I was like really, I was not even like frustrated, like really mad, but I was like, man, like, what do you mean he wasn't into this? Like, why wasn't he? I'm like, I'm so into this. Like, this makes so much sense to me. You know, why is it? And you know, and hearing him sort of speak about it, of course, it felt like he felt like it didn't have much tension because it was just sort of like things sort of cycling on loops, right? And hip hop, a lot of hip hop is of course loop based, where it's sort of repeating ideas. Those sort of discussions helped me to sort of also lean towards wanting to write about things like hip hop and sort of borrowing and sampling in my dissertation years later. But I think for me, again, it wasn't a point of frustration where I was like, I'm anti Carlos now, because I respect and revere the man greatly, but it made me become more aware of like how I should sort of navigate these environments and make myself at least be able to offer it to others, as to sort of say like, this is why I think it's valuable and why it's important. That's sort of where my dissertation would go throughout my doctoral studies. Starting a year later after that experience.
Yeah. We might be backtracking a little bit with this question, or maybe not, but what was the moment, or like when did you realize like you wanted to pursue this craft as a career, that you wanted to, or that you could?
Mm-hmm. I have admitted this to many people, or I'll tell them very bluntly, that it was getting a chance to meet and study with Belginder, specifically as a sophomore at USF. So, you know, 2011, whatever it was. But there was something about his sort of passion, his enthusiasm, the way he teaches, as you're familiar with, you know, there's something about that, his just approach and his appreciation of music and his just love of sort of teaching, that made me sort of react really positively to say that at that point I knew for sure that I wanted to do the exact same thing. And I think for me at least, the most significant realization was that he made me really love what I was doing musically. Of course, this is separate from the sort of identity question in the context of all that, but it was just sort of strictly about sort of being involved in music, writing music, and sort of the engagement with others, right, as a sort of as a musical journey. And of course, like trying to sort of spark the sort of interest and creativity in others. For me, it was very, very moving to have had that experience with him. That first experience with him, of course, because that carried on years afterwards. But it was that whole year essentially that made me realize, like, yeah, I actually feel like I want to do the exact same thing, because it's really special to have like one person basically
Yeah.
make me feel like this is so worthwhile and so valuable, and that I want to do the exact same thing and share that with others, and hopefully have them feel exactly as strongly as I do, to also carry on with their own journeys, whatever that may be.
Again, like I talk with folks who have gone to other programs and schools and had like really amazing composers, and I tell them all about like what Balgender does, and they're like, "What?" Like I wish I had that, you know? So, yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, of course I agree with you, and I totally feel where you're coming from.
definitely.
If you really want to stay connected to what I'm building here, the best way isn't social media, actually. It's the newsletter. That's where I share new episodes, unfiltered thoughts about the creative process, ways to support the work, and whatever's coming next. You can sign up at looseleaftransmissions.com or through the link in the show notes. You've mentioned that, jazz has been a big part of your musical foundation, and I'm sure that we can go on a huge tear about this, but kind of kicking things off with this subject of jazz. I mean, how does this influence show up in your work? Or maybe like has its presence in your work evolved over time, even, or how has that evolved?
The sort of simplest answer to this is, of course, having explored things harmonically. Once I've started to actually say, like, let me let sort of jazz influence my music in some sort of way. Actually, in fact, it was that kind of awareness that made me become somebody who was mostly harmonically focused. In fact, to this day, I'm still very much like harmonically focused. And this could be as simple as saying, like, present me with like a seventh chord.
Right,
It's
right,
kind of
right.
like a tonic idea, right? But going even beyond that, it's a matter of just simply kind of like navigating progressions, chord structures, harmonic cycles, whatever it is that are all that I have discovered and found, specifically in jazz. Not that they don't exist anywhere, but specifically in jazz as it presented, carried with things like just like the overall sound, the aesthetic of improvisation, the captivating journey of following like a jazz artist throughout multiple records and sort of seeing how things have evolved and shifted. Everything has sort of influenced my creative output in some regard. Like I said, maybe improvisation. I still am kind of a fearful of improvisation, at least for me. I like to be in control of most things, but I do oftentimes say like it's okay to kind of like riff on things as I desire. So I'm not anti improv. I just don't put in like slashes in my music, let's
Yeah,
say.
sure.
No, but certainly I would say harmony. Harmony for sure was the sort of first and still like the lasting element that I find has influenced my work and creative output the most. Again, the sort of idea that I could just sort of like sculpt large harmonic sort of structures, which may or may not be jazz influenced, but the fact that there are more complex harmonic structures that could influence underlying mechanism to a work, for me felt very much of interest for many years and still does to this day. Nowadays, I approach them more horizontally instead of just vertically, if that makes sense, right? And initially I was like, here's like a 7 note chord, a 9 note chord, let's work with this. But now I'm like, let's have that, but also like, how can I now navigate it in a horizontal sort of space too, for interest. And I should also say the other sort of main thing is also just like, it's simply put, like just like the sound of jazz, which of course is generalizing many different styles of jazz and subgenres of jazz. So I'm doing this with a big asterisk, of course, but sometimes hearing people like John Coltrane play makes me want to say like, I want that sound in this work because I feel like it just fits the kind of environment that I'm going for aesthetically. Certainly not to just like steal it or sort of say, like you have to play like Coltrane, but there's something about just like the nature of expression, the sort of the personal kind of approach of the sound. When you hear Coltrane, like that that's him.
Yeah.
Like without a doubt. It's like that kind of element that I really like. Thinking that I can maybe explore, discover as I present it musically. It's never like a goal, but it's just like I like hearing that. So maybe I'll try to go for the same thing.
Have you done much in the way of studying jazz? I mean, you mentioned that you started out as a jazz major, many moons ago. But, knowing what I know, and I think what a lot of people assume about Eastman, I mean, that's a very kind of, that's very traditional, classically oriented for the most part. So, I mean, is most of your, I guess I'll say jazz intake, is that just like listening to what you love and then filtering that through your music, or have you actually gone kind of out of your way to, have you taken classes? Have you taken lessons or studied or anything like that along the way?
Yeah, no, it's purposely only ever been through the element of listening. And it's not because I wouldn't take a class, because I in fact now I could find one at Oberlin. I'm sure like someone will let me into a class to kind of just like sit there and listen. But it's my relationship with jazz has always been one of just simply listening and appreciating and letting it kind of just like inspire me, not just musically but just in general. And I find that as I've become more knowledgeable and older and I've had more experience, my sensibility about how to filter that into my own sound has evolved and changed over time, where not having sort of an actual sort of conventional class in sort of jazz theory or jazz composition, and for me I feel like that's not necessary because the way I'm engaging with it is very different. I never to say that I'm a jazz composer. People always ask me like, oh, what kind of music do you write? Well, it's like I always say like I'm very much influenced by jazz, and I love listening to it, but I don't write jazz. I'm not
Yeah,
a
yeah.
jazz composer at all. And that for me is the kind of relationship that I love having with it because it strictly relies on just like the listening and the appreciation of it, and then letting that just sort of influence my background in some sort of regard without feeling like I have to sort of like present it as like the main focus of my musical output.
Yeah, I love this idea of like just like letting, I'll just say, non-classical music, filter into our work as composers. I think is a lot more compelling than like, okay, I love, you know, folk rock music. let's like write a folk rock piece. And then it's like, I would never be able to do that. Right. It's
Yeah.
like, or I wouldn't be able to do it in as compelling of a way as if I were to just be like, okay, what kind of elements can I kind of borrow from this and, adapt to my own musical voice? I think that's a much more compelling and I think even experimental approach to music than just kind of like hitting people over the head with it, in a classical
Yeah.
setting.
Definitely. I completely agree. And that's how I feel too. It also feels, like it would be for me very scary and difficult to say like I'm gonna write a jazz chart. It's like
Yeah.
I don't
Oh yeah.
want to because I'm very much intimidated by that idea. But like you said, like I just don't feel like it's as sort of compelling. You're right. That's the best word to put it. For me, it's more compelling to sort of navigate about the mechanism of trying to integrate into my sound currently. As opposed to saying like I'm going to replace my sound with this, which feels as a result again less sincere.
Yeah. I think I was reading about one of your pieces that it does, I think you describe it as like kind of setting a jazz combo in relation to an orchestra.
Yes, that is literally the orchestration is a jazz combo featuring mostly a sort of solo tenor sax voice with orchestra.
Yeah. So with all this in mind, I mean, how did you navigate like that specifically?
Yeah, it was very challenging because, well, for me it was challenging because I mostly write chamber music, like sort of smaller chamber music.
Yeah.
The largest I usually go is like maybe a chamber sinfonietta, maybe a little larger, but in terms of sort of like full orchestra, I only had ever written one other piece before that previously, and that was like many like I think I did like 8 years prior to that. It was a
Yeah.
very long time. But for me, I felt like excited and like it was time to get back into that kind of like environment, to sort of discover like how I can now approach this musical context with my newfound enjoyment of various things, jazz, so on and so forth. Also, the class I was teaching at the time, they were also going to write an orchestra piece. So I told myself like I should probably like write a new one to kind of like
Yeah. Yeah.
remind myself of the things that I'm going to be coming to terms with and grappling with as I compose this, to help kind of like give my students insight. So in a way, it was kind of like a two-pronged process that it ultimately paid off. So the challenge that I had, I think, mostly was trying to figure out how to like sort of navigate the orchestral sound to make it sort of serve the purpose of the combo. Because for me, at least, the hierarchy was like that the combo was sort of presented first, and the orchestra was simply supporting them, and that there of course there would be overlap, moments of dialogue and interaction. I mean, that's kind of like throughout the entire piece. But at the forefront is that it was meant to be sort of like this sort of symphonic jazz sound, where it's like the combo is there present. It's just the tenor sax soloist is like really in the foreground for sure, and then everything else is meant to just kind of be like just the garden behind it. They're just traveling through the garden behind it. You know, the one challenge that I had actually was is very much sort of the notation. I think if I were to redo it now, I would write it much, much more simply to read. I was writing it very much with a sort of chamber ensemble in mind. So there was a lot of complexities, a lot of meters, which I think, were unnecessarily complex for an orchestral context. I think also I would incorporate a bit more patience overall. I mean, the piece is very slow and sort of patient, as a lot of my output was back then, anyways. But there are certain moments, the music that I really loved, and I was like, I should have just like sat with this for longer. Like it almost like it could have been like here's like a jazz solo section. Like you just take these like 12 bars and just loop them. Like it could have been. It's like that kind of patience. I feel like I wish I could have incorporated more because it would have actually fit very well in the context. I do actually have plans to revise that piece soon. With all these kind of comments in mind, hence why they're so fresh for me because I've been like thinking about them beforehand. But at the end of it all, it was very much worthwhile and so much fun to write and get a chance to sort of hear it being put together and have it be rehearsed and hearing it be sort of presented as such, because it was one of the first times when I got to finally hear like such a sort of unique combination for myself,
Mm.
and kind of achieving the goal of saying like I want my influence and enjoyment to sort of come to the forefront. Again, the piece was not jazz at all. There were things which were jazz influenced besides just like the instrumentation, right, the combo and such, and the tenor sax soloist being somebody who would have to have like a jazz background for that sound. But there were other elements that came through which I loved hearing it in that context, and it made me sort of really enthusiastic about how to navigate that going forward. Even the drum set, like for me, like the drum set was such a huge component of that, and I felt like really happy about how it sort of came through together. And I was like, man, I love drum set now. I want to write with it more, or let them sort of improvise with it more for context. It was very much a learning experience in so many ways that I had not anticipated, and it's even to this day, it's still very much just like influencing how I'm thinking about things now.
And you mentioned hip hop, and I feel like hip hop is a little It isn't. It isn't like further. I mean, music is music, I think, but you know, jazz seems like very adjacent to classical, whereas hip hop music, I think people see as like this very like way over there. Like it's people can't see me, but I'm like gesturing like into the distance.
For
Um,
sure.
and I remember like I work for a classical music radio station, and one of my colleagues one time like the Beastie Boys came up in a meeting, and she like spoke with like almost like derision towards the Beastie Boys, which I love the Beastie Boys. And I'm like, you're allowed to, like that kind of music and the kind of music we do at work. Like, and so but still with that in mind, I mean, like how does hip hop like I imagine that's a little bit more challenging to incorporate into like a concert setting in like the ways that we're talking about.
Yeah, this fortunately starts to navigate into territories that I tackled with my dissertation studies, because I also wanted to discover the ways. I actually largely wanted to discover the ways that hip hop is a valuable and sort of meaningful art form. But I found that the question actually was answered very quickly, because while jazz is adjacent to classical music, hip hop, I argue, is very much adjacent to jazz, um, especially early hip hop with its use of sort of borrowing. I mean, it has always borrowed and sort of taken from historically things that came before it. In this case, things like sort of rock and roll, right, jazz, etc. So that kind of connection was always there. It's just simply one step later, and in a different sort of trajectory overall. So for me at least, when I've navigated the idea of hip hop, it's actually been less sonic and more about the sort of aesthetic principles that it's always sort of
Mm,
followed and sort of presented itself with things like sampling and borrowing and an awareness of sort of historical trajection. I find that the best hip hop DJs and artists are ones who are very much aware of things that came before them. They choose to borrow from these like random records from like the '70s, right, from black artists, therefore present it in this new context, in this new sort of format, create this new sort of artistry. That kind of principle, I find that is very much easy to apply to things like classical music, frankly, because I think in general we might all borrow all the time, anyways. I think that's a very normal thing to do, but with hip hop, it's sort of like you have to just not only know that it's happening, you also have to know what to do with it once you have it. From like both the listener and the sort of creator. So, for me, again, those principles find themselves very much at home in my approach for sort of notated concert music.
hearing you describe classical is adjacent to jazz, but then jazz is adjacent to hip hop. Do you ever feel like you can use jazz as a bridge to kind of like flip between that in like a concert setting? Do you feel like that's possible or even appropriate?
Definitely, it's absolutely possible, and if maybe it feels safer to say nowadays because there's just so much different music happening, with people trying so many different things out, that I've heard like all kinds of things on the concert stage, and I'm sure it's like not even like an iota of what there is available nowadays in general. But at least maybe it's because we're in 2025, but it feels like the answer is like yes, like of course you could hear this, because I'm just so used to hearing people try these things out all the time anyways. But certainly, at least for me, I think it's certainly something that's very much modern and new, and becoming increasingly more apparent in that people are maybe trying to bridge gaps between these sort of preconceived notions of like classical music, popular music, art music, whatever it is. I think it all very much can sort of like meld and become
Yeah.
sort of one type of music, just depending on whoever the person is and sort of what they want to achieve with the overall sound. I've certainly seen and heard examples of one group, for example, is Jazz Liberators. I don't know if you know them, but I always say, like, I always point to these guys as like a starting point for listening to this sort of idea of like a melted jazz plus hip hop sound. It kind of like mixes live playing with sampling with various rappers coming together. So it's almost like you could easily imagine that kind of context on a stage and listening to it for enjoyment, because it's all coming together, being sort of presented in the live format. It's not just strictly a studio work of art. And I find that even though I haven't really navigated in that territory, I feel like I have seen myself wanting to do that sort of thing where I can easily have like all these elements onto a stage, and then suddenly it's like just this influence art form that again sort of combines my experience that I've used to with sort of notated music, but also infighting of sort of the sort of poetic rhythmic element of rapping with the sort of kind of like background sampling element of jazz, of hip hop taking it from jazz. I mean, there's like again so many like layers of ways to kind of bring it together for this medium. Again, I just haven't done it yet because it's for me. It feels like it needs to be done at the right time. But also, I always have to question sort of where the most appropriate place for this would be, because I feel like oftentimes when you bring it to like a concert stage, like at a recital hall,
Yeah.
there's like a very clear aesthetic of people who are there to listen to the music. Whereas in the case of like hip hop, like you going to a hip hop concert means you're not going to be like sitting neatly like on a chair and like you're silent. You'll clap when it's done. There's very much different sort of aesthetics for these sorts of things too. So outside of the compositional territory, I'm also thinking about just aesthetically, like when it's presented sort of for a public audience, like what exactly do I anticipate and expect? Can I expect people to be nodding their head and grooving and clapping? Should they? Would they? I hope they would. But those are questions for when the time comes, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll have to find the right place. I agree with you that I think the traditional, I mean, for contemporary music in general, let alone like the kind of music that we're talking about and describing, I mean, I feel like the concert hall or the recital hall or that kind of more traditional space falls short in a lot of ways. And, I don't have I think people should be able to clap when they like jazz, like if you go see a jazz combo play, soloist does their thing, people are clapping while music's still happening. I don't think that necessarily should get in the way of, the experience. I think, yeah. But I think like
Totally.
it's not allowed in the concert hall, right? Maybe it's our job to change that. So so shifting gears just a little bit, some of your recent work has incorporated birdsong, which I'd love to hear more about, especially since there's like this kind of rich tradition of birdsong in classical music in general. So how recently did this start for you, and what's been surprising about trying to translate that, admiration for birdsong into sound in your music?
Yeah, it's the starting point for this discussion is that my wife and I both share an immense love and appreciation for birds and have for quite a while actually. But I never really thought about it as influencing my music at all. I knew there was an awareness. I knew that there was birdsong influenced sort of music and the history, as you sort of put it, of it beforehand. And I had listened to it beforehand, but again, with never really like thinking like I could maybe do this exact same thing. But it wasn't until I say the last few years where I was like, maybe I should try this out as just like a way to kind of see how it might kind of influence or change what I'm doing nowadays. And initially, and I would say until like really recently, it's mostly been simply through sort of aesthetic or sort of imagery, right? I would say like, oh, I love the look of this bird. Let's say like a macaw. Like I love how they look. I love how they sort of interact with each other. So like that would be like the inspiration for the piece. That there's like this visual appreciation of them, their sort of personality, etc. But not necessarily anything sonically. It's just purely like I like them. Here's a piece that's inspired by my fascination, essentially, right? I guess it depends on who you ask if that counts as a bird song or not. But I find it at least it is still bird inspired. But it wasn't really until very very recently, like in the last like year and a half, I'd say, where, and especially coming more into contact with Messiaen's work, that I was reminded of the fact that wait, they also do sing. Like birds do sing all the time.
Yeah.
They make sounds that I also copy and I whistle back at them all the time when I can, or I whistle for myself because it's fun. And I was like, maybe I should like let that also be part of my language. Like, how can I sort of navigate this in that context? Messiaen, of course, is I would say the composer that people probably point to the most when they think about birdsong, and getting a chance to sort of study his work more sort of intently to sort of see exactly how it navigates sort of the tools in which he's sort of grappling with them, the difficulties in trying to sort of like recreate or sort of recontextualize that which is not notated music, which again, that's normal anyways. It's been a lot of fun to sort of navigate, and all of it is again grounded in just sort of appreciation that I've had for birds prior to this. So it makes me feel like the connection that I have with him now is even more sort of unique and special because it's just like that I'm finding that a lot of enjoyment out of, and I'm finding that it's very much a very enormous world of musical potential. There's so many ways to sort of navigate this approach and this style and I find that at least for me, I either choose sort of a bird or series of birds based on either how they look, their sort of environmental context, like where are they from, right, or actually what they sound like their songs, their calls, so on and so forth. So between those three contexts, I've been sort of incorporating this idea of sort of birdsong or influence by birds more and more in my work. And just like with jazz and hip hop previously, it's sort of a result of appreciation and things that I really like seeing as part of like my identity. Like, even people, even my students at school know that I'm a big bird person. My office is full of birds everywhere. Same here in my home. The same thing like in our living room. It's full of bird stuff. So it's mostly a matter of just saying like unapologetically, we love this sort of thing. Here it is also influencing my creative work in some sort of regard here, and I can talk about it.
I mean, what you're bringing to mind, not to make light of any of this, but like the meme that you start seeing, like where millennials, like people our age, suddenly get into birds, and I can't say that we are like super into birds. We admire them when they come by. We had birds build a nest in a wreath on our front door and we just let them do it because it's like, okay, I guess they chose us. But shout out to our friend Shelley Washington, who's a composer, and her parents, Sarah and Syl. We were visiting them in Kansas City, and they were going on and on about like how they have the special bird seed and they have all the bird feeders out. And we're like, oh, maybe we should become bird people. And then like the next Christmas, they gave us like our first bird feeder with their seed mix and stuff
Oh
like that.
man,
So I don't know. We might.
that's so real.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's real.
We're like researching the bird store. There's like a bird store with all the stuff that you need. Anyway, so I don't know. I guess I bring that up because I feel like that could be an entry point for people who might not be familiar with contemporary music. I mean, it's like, oh, like I love birds. Let's let's go hear this piece.
It's true. And in fact, as I pointed out, my wife, who has always influenced my music since I've met her, again, she's an enormous bird person as well. And she's non-musical. She's an artist, visual artist, but no musical training at all. So whenever I introduce her to things, it's always like, I want your opinion as like an audience member who has like no training.
Yeah,
Like, what do you think?
yeah.
And she's become increasingly aware and is very quick to sort of point out and catch when such bird things exist in my music. She can hear them very clearly. It's like, oh yeah, it's that bird. Like I agree. It's actually very much in very approachable and transient element that I really quite like. It's almost kind of fun in a way to kind of like put those in there and sort of see what people can sort of find out.
Well, you brought up Messiaen, which of course is like the only composer I can think of who also did this, even though I think other composers did. I think Vivaldi might have done it too. And of course others between those 2 points. But thinking about like Messiaen, if Messiaen's like the most recent, like significant composer that we know as being like someone who does birdsong, he wouldn't have had internet. He would have had to like only have access to birds in his immediate vicinity, which might have, only been in Europe. So I mean, I'm sure that like the internet age and being able to like travel just about anywhere, within a day and coming in contact with, all these different birds, whether online or in person. I mean, I'm sure that might like affect your approach to begin with, but do you think that your approach to birdsong has started to take like a shape that feels different or even more personal from how others have done it?
Yeah, I'm really happy you brought that point up. I recently did a presentation in my class on Messiaen's Oiseau Exotique. It's that like Fit 1956 sort of chamber piece, which is like full of just like a cacophony of different bird sounds from across the world, essentially. And in discovering it, of course, Messiaen was certainly aware of the birds in his area, but he also did travel. I mean, he labeled himself as an ornithologist. Like he was very much like, this is what I do, also, not just music. So he very much was out in the field recording. Notating things down there. He was very much invested in actually sort of exploring, sort of grabbing these things for himself, because of course, as you pointed out, there was no internet back then to offer you instantaneity and accessing these things. So when I first started getting into it, actually, a lot of it was because of research into what Messiaen was doing. He would label like, let's say, white-rumped shama or something in his score, and okay, let me look up that bird. Let me kind of read about it. Messiaen also would kind of like write these little blurbs in his front matter about the visuals of the birds, their kinds of calls,
Mm.
etc. So he was very much invested in sort of like presenting them with much knowledge, to find out that like everything that I researched was also accurate. Like everything was like the exact same as he put it, and even like a lot of times the same bird calls would exist pretty much in the exact same format, even like multiple decades later. Of course, bird calls can and do change over time, but a piece that is like 60, 70 years old, it's really remarkable to find that the bird calls back then for like the American robin are like the exact same as they are now.
Yeah.
You know, it's with of course variety as it happens, but that awareness helped me feel like, okay, not only is there enough birdsong online that I can of course refer to if I ever want to for, let's say, research, but I should actually also go out into the field and like just listen, in the same way that I was listening to jazz for fun for myself. I now go out and just listen to birdsong just for fun and for myself. I record them sometimes. Mostly I just like whistle them and I kind of memorize it in my head because it's easier and faster. Of course, living in Ohio, there's the classic handful of things like the American robin. There's chickadees here, cardinals, one of the most boisterous ones we hear all the time, etc. So it's a nice kind of like local snapshot of what's kind of in the environment around you. I've gone to Florida and done the same thing. There's just a plethora of different birds there. Same thing. I've gone out west to Arizona with my wife. Same thing. So it becomes increasingly more personal as I've like discovered these bird songs for myself with whatever the context is that I hear them, as opposed to relying strictly on what I might find on like eBird, let's say, or where people have collected and compiled, tirelessly so many bird songs, which of course are very much valuable and certainly are get used through my own influence. But my most recent work that I'm working on right now, or at least like starting to plan out, is actually relying on like strictly bird song that I've heard myself and that I've compiled for myself with local sort of wildlife in the area of Northeast Ohio. Which again could have been as easy as just saying like, let me just search these birds and just, like use what I find online. But it feels more sincere and again like a snapshot of like this is what's happening right now in 2025 that I'm discovering. Like now let's put this in the musical context.
Right. And then that, like, I feel like would have a profound effect on like your overall body of work where like, a decade from now you can look back and be like, okay, here's like music inspired by like a moment I was in Florida. Here's, I was in Ohio, I was in New York, Arizona, wherever.
Totally,
Yeah.
definitely.
So usually by the time I ask this next question, it's been answered in some way, but I'll ask you more directly. What would you describe as the primary pillars of your creative practice? And this could be, philosophically, stylistically, aesthetically, process wise, like whatever the foundation might be.
Yeah, right now, and this is something that I've started to kind of like champion for my students, or at least to kind of remind them, is to make sure that there's some semblance of fun being had doing and doing the process of writing music or composing, or anything that requires some kind of creative output, or a subjective response. It's to have fun with these sorts of things. I feel like too often these the way we engage with art can be much too daunting and much too critical, which of course is valid and can be valid when it's time to. But when I start to see it's where somebody might be so critical on themselves that it's kind of influencing their output negatively, I have to like ask, like, you having fun doing this? What will make you have fun with this kind of process? And frankly, I should say there is, of course, a challenge that has to be overcome with composing. Like composing, it definitely is all about challenges and overcoming them. But I would argue that it should be without the cost of like losing out on the fun aspect of this. You know what I mean? And at least for me, maybe it's because it's just the way I think about things and the kind of optimist that I like to be. But I've started to ask myself more recently, like, am I having fun doing this? And recently, my answer has been yes. Like, I actually have been having pretty much a lot of fun, sort of composing and sort of navigating the challenges and sort of coming up with ideas and letting my things and my various influences inspire me. I'm having fun with the process. I'm having fun with what I hear at the end of it. And I'm having certainly fun with people I meet who also share a similar regard. There's something very just kind of reassuring and important, I think, about just like the positivity and the enthusiasm and the fun aspect of just engaging with music. It's very special that people like ourselves can engage with music as a sort of career choice. You know what I
Right,
mean?
right.
At a professional level and share that with others. I feel very grateful for it. So for me, I like to show my gratitude by making sure that I am enjoying this. So that enjoyment is important for me. Another pillar would be just to ensure that I'm being very patient with myself with the process, but also patient with the musical material as well. And this is something that I feel like I tell my students all the time too. It's like I make sure you take enough time with the material. Like don't like just shoot to the next idea so quickly. Because again, for me at least, there's something very special about the creative process when you create this one moment in the music where things are happening, things are unfolding, there's a context for it with things happening before and afterwards. And my thought is I want to make sure that I give these things enough time that they are allowed to sort of say what they have to say before moving on, or before leading us to the next, So that kind of facet of patience certainly evolved from my appreciation and love of Takamitsu's music and his overall aesthetic approaches as well, because I find his music to be remarkably patient in many, many ways. And that's something that I've always, that I adopted very quickly once I really got to sort of deep dive into researching his work. And I've carried it with me to this day. Just this idea of just like, take your time, be patient, there's no rush. So fun and patience, I would say, are our two biggest sort of pillars. And my
Yeah.
third one, of course, would be, as I am a proponent now, is just, of course, embracing identity and letting that, again, influence, inspire, or at least to be aware of it as part of one's own artistic and philosophical background. Everyone's lived experience is very much different, and there's nothing wrong with letting that be a part of the musical output. For me, that makes it even more just like tangible as like a reality. Like this is like you now on the page, or we're hearing you, sonically, because you're allowing it to exist as such. Again, and that's a result, of course, of my own journey, my own trajectory, my own grappling of things throughout school and such, and becoming increasingly more aware of myself as somebody of color. But I find that again, for anybody, it's important to allow your identity to at least be present. It doesn't have to be always involved. It doesn't have to be at the foreground of things if you don't want it to be, but at least that there's a presence of this sort of thing, and that could be either cultural identity or as sort of like an interest, like birdsong, for example. It could even go just to what you're into, what you like doing. Again, let it be part of the musical experience if you want it to be. Like, there's no rule that says you can't. After all,
I have a couple thoughts based on everything you just said. Patience is something that I recently have been describing as my own pillar. And I did a solo episode to kick off this season. It released we're recording this on June 2nd. I released that episode May 13th, May 15th, May 15th. But it's something that, like, over the past few years I've only started realizing. And you're right, like there is so much like satisfaction in actually taking the time to like shape a moment. And you mentioned Takamitsu again. I think his best music, it's like clouds floating in the sky. That's what comes to mind. I think maybe he even,
definitely.
he has all kinds of music about rain coming and stuff like that too. So, but I'm really curious to know more about like this idea of fun and like where that came from. Not because like this isn't fun or can't be fun. Of course it is. But I'm mostly wondering, like, was there ever a moment where you kind of realized maybe you weren't enjoying it and you had to like kind of get back to basics or move back and like rescue yourself, maybe not to be too like dramatic about it?
Yeah, I sort of alluded to it earlier when I had sort of mentioned kind of like the discovery of the question of like what is a composer, like what am I doing as a composer? Because despite me, of course, having the most respect for Belgian, of course, and my time at USF, I never felt like I had a lot of fun doing a lot of things. I mean, I had fun like doing it because it was part of the process, and I was like, yeah, I'm doing it. Like, this is great. But there's a reason like why I don't speak about any of my work prior to like 2015. Let's say like that's the thing for me. 2015 is like the starting point, which kind of omits like 4.5, 5 years of music prior to that. And so this question of fun for me is something that I was at least not really kind of grappling with initially, at least in 2015 and so on. But it was more about, am I proud of what I'm doing? Is it capturing me as an artist? Is it representing itself in a significant way? And the answer over time has become increasingly yes. But it was never just like strongly yes until again maybe about 2016, 2017, when I started to finally let things like jazz influence my creative output, right? That's when I was like, oh, I'm having a lot of fun with this. I'm having a lot of fun like extracting quotes from Coltrane's Naima and putting it in this sort of
Yeah.
context where I'm loving, looking at the sky and seeing the Ursa Minor constellation and saying like, I want those 7 stars to be in my piece. Like those things for me were fun, and it's become increasingly fun over time since those moments. Because again, it feels like for me, I'm just allowing all of my work to be influenced by something which is just very immediate, very much centered about throughout my enjoyment of various things, whatever they are. And it's less about just like, oh, write this piece because we're telling you to. Again, it's not about. There's nothing against the overall process because sometimes it has to be the way we're learning, frankly. But it's become just easier now, especially as I'm older, to say like I will have fun with this piece writing it instead of like dreading it and being scared about things. It's like no, like let me have fun doing this because frankly, it's a lot of investment and a lot of work and a lot of
Yeah.
emotional energy and mental energy to do these things and not have fun with it. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
Like I don't want to do that for the rest of my life. Like not have fun with all this investment. So um, another example recently, actually, as I've started to tap into my Latino background, and I think one of the reasons why I never really grappled with it previously is because for me, my Latino heritage is very much close to my family. You know, I grew up with my mom and my grandma on my mom's side, and they're all Latinos from both New York, and prior to that, Ecuador. So for me, hearing like Latino music, Latino food, speaking Spanish even has always been this very, very personal, very intimate, very familial sort of undertaking. And I felt like music for me was never that kind of environment for it until recently, where I'm like, I want to now let that be part of this. So when I listen to music that is inspired in some sort of fashion in Latino environment, so let's say like Celia Cruz, for example, or any kind of music that has like rhythm and groove, and there's, you know, and they're, of course they're singing in Spanish, and for me it feels like it's interesting. It feels so familiar and it feels so normal. And when I hear these things, I'm like brought back to my childhood. And for me, I started to like want to dance. So that to me is again another era of fun. Like I have fun listening to these things, and I want to hear them now in my own music as well. So a lot of my most recent work has started to again to navigate fun in that kind of context. Yeah, I wrote this piece in October, or that was premiered in October, called Cuervos, which means crows, and it's for bassoon, two percussion, and piano. So it's a
Mm.
quartet and four connected movement, and like the actual sort of, again, it's not meant to be sort of programmatic, but the imagery is just like it's a sort of party, right? A Latino party, and they're all crows, and they're all just getting drunk on tequila, having a good time, and there's a lot of dancing and energy and vibrance, and eventually at some point you're of course too drunk to do anything, and you just like relax and take a neat of that. Again, for me, that's very much like my upbringing and context. So, you know, that was the first piece where I was like, man, I had fun doing this. Like I'm finally like aware of the fact that, oh, fun actually is really an important part of doing this sort of thing, because, you know, from the onset, that's like what I wanted the piece to kind of embody, because of that one context of it being just kind of like rooted from my Latino experience.
That's the perfect segue to my next question, because I was wanting to dig into all of this, and you've mentioned, and you're just talking about, you've been reconnecting with your Latino heritage in your music. I have to say, I was going through your works list on your website, and like all of the pieces since I think like 2021 are all in like Spanish titles, and the one before that was Black Portrait, which of course also has to do with your identity. And then I was listening to that piece, Cuervos, and I was struck by like I was impressed, but it was unsurprising because you're a great composer. You were incorporating all these rhythms and kind of this like feeling of Latin American music and all this stuff in a way that wasn't like bashing me over the head with it, and in a way that was just like so beautifully woven together in a way that made sense. So, you've talked about how this shows up in your work with rhythm and energy. Has this shifted the way that you approach your writing at all, like in turning to your heritage? Or even like, I mean, you talked about how like you're having fun composing now. I mean, does it do any other feelings come up in working with this kind of music?
Yeah, it's interesting how just dramatic this shift happened in the last year, I'd say, with my music in general, because because of the Takamitsu influence and this idea of patience we talked about, my music has become, or my music was very slow, very much patient, intentionally for a very long time. Since like 2017 or so. I mean, all my works were, with very much glacial tempo markings, like 40, 45. And again, it was meant for me at least to remind myself to like take my time and unfold gestures in this extended horizontal space. I felt like I achieved quite enough of that, at least in a way that then I was thinking like I needed to start like now accessing rhythm and energy. So when I think of rhythm and energy, again, for me, I thought about fun. And when I think about those sorts of things, again, it brings me back to my childhood, being with family, surrounded by family, with amazing food and just like loud, vibrant, rhythmic music. And I was like, I want to now navigate rhythm again, or to really focus in on rhythm as being a component of my music, and letting this be kind of the sort of like, again, the mechanism for getting me to sort of to navigate it in a meaningful way. So it's nice to hear you sort of say something about Corvals, because initially I was very worried about the piece, thinking like, I'm trying to do so many new different things at once,
Yeah.
but at the same time still trying to incorporate things like patience or my harmonic language, etc., in this sort of context. But for me, I felt like I struck a really nice balance of working both with kind of like rhythmic energy and so sort of like just the kind of fun excitement of this environment, musical environment. I feel like I really achieved a nice balance of that with elements of my sort of like my standard works of things being patient or my harmonic language being as sort of dense as it is where it's sort of like self-sufficient and such. Working with things like a bassoon was amazing because I love the bassoon. But yeah, it's and the only piece before that that I really was starting to really get into things rhythmically was this work for a sax quartet called Guacamayas, which is Spanish for macaws. I know I mentioned macaws earlier, but that was the piece where I was inspired by just like the visual beauty of macaws, their kind of like personalities, etc. And that was one where in a way I was actually forced to think more rhythmically and horizontally because somebody who likes writing 5, 6, 7, 8 note chords could not do that with a sax quartet without relying on something like electronics.
Right, right.
Um, at first I wanted electronics in that piece because of my reluctance to not have enormous harmony. Before I was like, no, that's a crutch. Let me actually figure this out. So I was like, let's think about harmony horizontally instead. So as a result of rhythm emerged from it, and that to me was like, it unlocked the door to say like, actually, I should probably keep trying this out. So that's why Cuervo sort of worked the way it did because again, from the onset, I was like, I actually will make rhythm and the exploration of rhythm through the lens of fun being kind of like the main proponent of this environment.
So I kind of maybe was alluding to, I've maybe been tiptoeing around my opinions about like this kind of thing, this whole conversation. But again, I feel like sometimes when composers incorporate, I'll say non-classical elements from, even other cultures, or I mean, there's so many examples of composers doing that so well. Don't get me wrong, including your music. But sometimes it just feels like a little kitschy if it's not done right. And so I'm curious to know, like, when you incorporate more Latin American rhythms or harmonies, or even go into jazz or what have you. I mean, do you feel like it's reliant on who is playing it, or do you like build in something into your notation or sheet music that you feel like unlocks, then anyone can like kind of play this music stylistically, maybe even like with the right spirit, that you intend.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I find that when I notate these things on paper, of course, when you notate anything, it does kind of force it into some sort of grid for tangibility's sake, right? Pulling it from the ether onto the paper does something to the actual material, which that's how it is. So my way around this is to try to make sure that at the very least I'm incorporating plenty of descriptive words in the music that help to kind of like capture either an interpretation or just like an air in which things to be played, and especially for those who might be unfamiliar with the style, the context, etc. In most cases, this is present through my tempo marking. My tempo markings always are like an actual kind of like some sort of narrative explanation. Not like super long, but even just like one word, which can maybe capture just like this is the element of this section. Play it in this sort of way. But again, increasingly, I've started to actually just put in boxes everywhere where, not everywhere all the time, but I will sort of supply extra explanations about ways to sort of navigate things, whether I say play this flamboyantly, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah, yeah.
dance like, with verve, patiently, heavy and grounded. I mean, even those little words like really help to capture, I think, an interpretation and a feeling about what I'm looking for without sort of blockading somebody's interpretation afterwards, because frankly I still very much respect and almost require and want a performer's interpretation to come through, you know what I mean? So my assistance is there just to help make sure that someone's not lost in the exploration of trying to achieve these sorts of things, you know what I mean? I guess the hardest way to navigate this would be when I want someone to swing a rhythm, and wanting players to swing is always like it's like one of the hardest things ever when going from sort of like a jazz inspired territory to anything else, and I've done the thing where I'm like, oh, eighth note equals, the quarter eighth triplet, they're all approximations for what is essentially a feeling, But again, for me, at least it's like I'll say like, here's the feeling you're aiming for, swing them, what I mean? But don't of course swing them in a corny way, So again, at a certain point, I have to kind of give as much explanation as I can. But if someone doesn't know it entirely, it's like, well, that's okay. It's not going to, like, for me at least, ruin the piece or the experience, because at the very least, I'm hopefully making them aware of an approach that can be incorporated like after the fact, or that they'll learn for this context, and then thus they've learned something new for for the part of the piece. But yeah, it's interesting. I don't typically think about the if like the player will capture it unless I'm working with the player like directly.
Yeah.
For example, for Cuervos, I was writing it two of my colleagues at Oberlin, Dana, Justin, and Ross Carr. So like I've been communicating with them. I've worked with them previously, in context. I see them all the time. So I very much knew of like what they could do, what they like doing, what they're scared of, what they're not scared of. So they were very much open to anything. So in that kind of context, it's very easy. I just say like, hey, here's the music, here's some explanation. They got it handled. I find that when my music has been the slowest and the most patient is when it's actually the hardest for interpretation. I have to remind people to be slower and be more patient, and that I haven't discovered a way to make it more clear in the music. If I say chord note equals 40 and they do it at 50, it's like I can't do anything else at that point, besides say like, hey, it's actually too fast.
Yeah, right. Well, not to mention like this, I don't know, I sometimes find myself or talk to other composers who find themselves in the situation where it's like the music might, if you have like quarter note equals 40 and it's like half notes, whole notes, and you're trying to achieve a certain texture, some people might look at it and be like, oh, I don't have to practice this. It's easy. It's like, I don't have to think about it. But like, that's the music you have to like think about more than anything,
100%. 100%. Yeah. And I'm sure as you as a brass player also have practiced them tirelessly, whole notes, holding them out, keeping the
Yep.
tone clear. You know what I
Yep.
mean?
Yep, it takes it's actually a lot of work. Well, I'm so glad that you
Yeah.
brought up these descriptions. If anything, just so I can like kind of touch on these a little bit, and we can talk. I mean, you kind of summed it up, but I was looking at your website, and you have like the first pages of the scores on your composition list, and some of these descriptions are so evocative, like a serenely shimmering midnight desert, which is beautiful. I can like see that, or a lush and vibrant lavender blue, which I can't see that because I'm not good with colors. So, like you've kind of talked about like why this is like significant for your music, but what kind of response have you gotten from performers when they come across these kind of descriptions in your work?
I've only ever received positive response for it. And luckily, in the way that I've achieved the most, in that I love allowing these things to be open for interpretation. Because, of course, especially when it comes to color, or even just like an environment, people have sort of a different reaction or a different response to what that means in context. And that's exactly what I aim for when I present such information. For me, it's capturing kind of like my feeling about the sort of section, about the whole piece, very immediately and very much within the context that I'm establishing for the piece.
Yeah.
But again, I do it with the complete intention that it's supposed to be actually still interpretive. When I say lavender blue, there's still just like infinite shades of what that could mean in context. And for people who say are not synesthetic, that could mean something for them in context. Again, that's what I want. I want you to sort of capture this sort of type of marking as a sort of realm or a territory of different emotional responses that you can then sort of represent in the music as such. Again, it's only ever been successful, luckily.
Yeah, I feel like probably about the time I got to grad school, I actually started formally studying composition, which I hadn't before that point. I kind of stripped my music of this kind of stuff, and it was like quarter note equals whatever, and then that was all people got, or like the occasional like Italian marking, or like
Mhm.
well, usually I would present that in English, but it was like nothing
Right, right.
nothing very descriptive. And it was probably about 4 years ago, I was working on a string quartet, and I was writing the string quartet for Japanese musicians to play too, I should add. And I took a lesson with a composer mentor of mine, James Grant, and he was like, I think you should load this up with descriptions, man. Like just go for it. And I did. And then I even like had a Japanese friend help me translate the descriptions to Japanese. And that got me thinking about music in like a totally different way. I think, one, writing the descriptions themselves, but then like thinking about how to convey that in a different language, even, which I'm sure you're familiar with your titles, being in Spanish and being bilingual. And yeah, I just like, that's just something that I've tried to, like, I just finished a solo piano piece, and I'm kind of procrastinating on it, but the very last thing I want to do is like go through and add just like little indications, like not tempo markings, not like musical indications, just like interpretive descriptions throughout the piece. Like it because you're right, like performers respond to it in a totally different way than if it's just like quarter note equals XYZ.
I'm really happy to hear you kind of bring your experience with this, because I feel like I have had the exact same experience and the exact same like reaction afterwards. I'm like, oh, this actually is actually better overall
Yeah.
for the what I want in the end, and also what I want for performers to actually get out of it in the end. And whenever when I'm working with a student who is doing a similar thing where it's just like here's just like corner equals 100, right, or just Italian, I'm like, can you possibly give me something else here that could be perhaps to capture the element of what the section is a bit more concisely, or at least interpretive, or allow it to be more interpretive for a performer. And sometimes it might be a struggle to kind of like get them to really kind of like want to push outside of the territory of the safe Italian terminology for tempo marking and such. But again, I genuinely find that, especially for modern living composers, especially ones who are, let's say, a newer composer, where people might not know your aesthetic, your background, your approach, your sound. These are elements that can all help performers get to know you and get to know
Mm.
your music and get to know the piece, at least as a whole by itself, let's say, at the very least. So yeah, so if you say like heavy, patiently, take your time, I mean, just any of these instructions really do help to offer just that extra bit more of clarity for what you're really aiming to achieve for your music. But at the same time, again, it could give performers a chance to sort of like actually offer something for the musical experience as well of their own, because you're holding your hand out for them to say like, let's make it happen together. It's so valuable. I can't stress that enough. I'm so glad that I'm so glad I've been able to do it for myself more and more without feeling like worried that I'm maybe being a bit too much, using too much prose, or am I too out there with these descriptions? Like, no, I'm like, just go for it, because it
Yeah.
really does capture what I'm looking for, actually almost better than just the notes themselves in a way.
Yeah, I think that was what it was for me, is I was like, am I like being a little too emotional or poetic, or like when I shouldn't be, and that kind of thing. But it's like people appreciate that. I spoke with one composer for the podcast, Nathan Hudson, and he said that and I love this. He will provide at the top of every score, like and I can't quote it verbatim right now. I don't have it in front of me, but it's like this, like it is almost like a little poem where he just like says this really kind of ambiguous thing that has almost nothing to do with the music, but everything to do with the music. And he says he does that to start a conversation with performers. He said people will see this and be like, "Hey, what does this mean?" And then he can like open up a conversation, which I think is like a really beautiful and a kind of a funny strategy, that I'm kind of
Yeah,
like, oh, maybe I should do that too.
I love that. Wow, I've never heard of something like that before, but I would also react the same way. Like, I actually would want to have a conversation, so I guess that worked out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's so cool.
Tyler here, and if you're enjoying this episode of Music Maker, well, just know that I've got a short form show called Micro Maker. Think of it as a distilled version of these conversations, focused on powerful insights that you can listen to anytime. New episodes twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. Give it a follow. So, kind of in this vein, talking about like interpretation of your music, maybe, or maybe not. You said you're especially drawn to writing music for fellow musicians of color. So, I'm wondering, like, what feels different or even more personal about those collaborations for you?
Yeah, I feel so fortunate, honestly, that I am like regularly surrounded by incredible musicians of color, not just at Oberlin, but in my time at Eastman as well. But the reality is that there is, of course, much fewer black performers, right? Much fewer Latino performers, etc. Composers, even especially. So, it does, at least in my experience going through school, it makes one feel very isolated. You can feel very alone when you don't see people who look like you near around you, and in an environment that's supposed to be very special and kind of impactful for you. You know what I mean? So, luckily I didn't let that sort of stop me. That's of course why I turned to things like jazz and hip hop to kind of like help influence my craft beyond this. So, I told myself that once I got into a position like this where I could, regularly navigate with students, especially ones of color, that I would always make an effort to say like, hey, I'm here. I'm present with you, and if it makes sense to, or if the time is right, or if you have time to do so, because frankly, the students are way too busy, that I would love to sort of like just like do something, just
Mm,
collaborate, whether it's a piece or just, hey, can you play on my piece, or I'll write you something, And again, for me, I feel like I'm very grateful for the opportunity to do so. But in my head, at least, I'm thinking, I hope that it helps to sort of allow for the sort of familiar space or the reality that there are others like me in this sort of context, that we're not alone, and it can hopefully make the journey a bit less isolating or potentially isolating, as it were.
Do you have a like a memorable collaboration of this kind, or one that you feel like kind of shifted things for you a little bit?
Yeah, I really one of the most remarkable ones that I've had recently. I can speak about this because we just got done recording the piece. Actually, a recent graduate of Oberlin, he literally just graduated this semester. So congrats to Solomon Leonard. He's a viola student. People who know me know that I'm like pro viola. I'm like, viola is the best string instrument. Like,
It's a
don't
great
come at
instrument.
me. Um, no, I love all of them, but I'm for sure a proponent of viola. So Solomon, he played on the piece you mentioned earlier, a Black Portrait, actually, back in 2021, whatever it was. And the piece has not like a sort of like major solo, like viola solo part, but the piece begins with solo viola. It's very crucial throughout the overall work. Again, very intentionally, because I love viola. I'm like, yeah, I need this to be kind of like the carrier of a lot of gestures and sounds. So that was the first interaction I ever had with Solomon, because he played on that piece. And I was just like blown away by not only how incredible of a violist he was, but just like his general presence and his attitude and his enthusiasm about the violist. Like, to this day, I've never met somebody so enthusiastic and passionate about their instrument as someone
Yeah.
like Solomon. He's like, he wants to like teach and make people aware of the viola in a way that I've never seen it. And I love hearing him just talk about the instrument. I brought him to my classes to talk about viola. Like, it's really quite special. So yeah, my connection with Solomon has just evolved since that moment of him playing, just the viola part on Black Portrait, to the point that now, near the end of his degree track where he just graduated, I actually was like, I need to write you a solo piece. So I actually wrote him a solo work for viola, a 12-minute long solo called Plumaje. He premiered it on my faculty recital back in March. He played it again at his senior recital last month. Again, it was amazing, amazing thing to be able to hear him play like this. And we just got done recording it together, just kind of like ad hoc for ourselves. But it's moments like that where working with a Black violist who is just so talented, so incredibly skilled, so thoughtful, so professional, and so, again, just so enthusiastic about music and just life in general, that it's and the fact that he's also a color, again, makes me just feel just like not only proud of him, like excited. I'm like, yes, this is a thing that happens. You know what I mean? And this connection just came through because he played on a piece of mine that I wrote as a sort of self portrait of myself. As a Black artist. And who would have known that I would have been so lucky to have someone like him play it. Or play on that piece, because then it resulted in this sort of like ongoing collaboration. And Solomon, of course, is a great, just a person in general, but he's also played like on many of my students' pieces. Like, he's always like in the department playing student works.
Yeah.
So him having graduated and having achieved what he had, again, it's just like it all kind of comes together for me, where it's like this whole connection like grew out of like one experience, 4 years ago, essentially. And I'm just so thankful for it. That's the kind of thing that I'm always striving for when I meet, fellow musicians of color, and especially students at Oberlin, because, again, I feel like there's always a possibility for that kind of growth and enthusiasm beyond just like the Oberlin environment. Like, I know Solomon and I will be talking for the rest of our lives, essentially.
Yeah.
And it's very special to have that.
Oh, yeah. That's beautiful. So, keeping in mind like your myriad of interests, I'm sure that you could answer this next question like with a lot of different things, and feel free to. But what is a piece of music or a song, a film, book, piece of art? The list goes on. Pretty much any kind of like artistic artifact, like I like to call it, that changed the way that you thought about your work, or even changed your life.
I always say, yeah, it's true, that my favorite piece of music of all time is Archipelago S by Toru Takamitsu. That and a lot of people don't know that piece, actually, as I've discovered, presenting it to students and colleagues and such. But this is work for this like large ensemble, and because it's based on archipelagos, the ensemble's arranged with like three different like islands on stage, and then like these two antiphonal clarinets like in the actual audience. It's this very, very lovely work. Again, it's one of this very gestural, patient. One of his late works, I believe, 1992 or three, one of those 2 years, right before he passed away. But I discovered that piece like when I was like 19, like a sophomore in at USF, not knowing how impactful Takamitsu would be for me, not knowing anything about his background, his history, the things that I would come to learn years and years later. But the reason why I say that it's my favorite piece of music is not only because it's one of the earliest that I can remember feeling so strongly in a positive way towards, but because I've gone back to it throughout the years all the time, and I always am discovering something new about this, whether it's with regard to the music itself, the way it's constructed, elements of the music, or even just thinking about sort of like in the contextual timeline of talking about this output, like what this piece means for everything else sort of surrounding it, and whenever I feel like I need inspiration, whether it's gestural, rhythmic, harmonic, with regard to patience or writing, I always go back to that work. I'm like, I need to listen to Archipelago S for a little bit. And oftentimes I'll just listen to it just for fun anyways, because, we should always listen just for fun and not for
Yeah.
analytical reasons, right? But again, I think that piece offers me so much, and has offered me so much throughout the years, that I can't think of another work that has impacted me for so long in so many different ways that I am able to keep coming back to. Again, it's one where I feel like it's one that I can probably speak about for the rest of my life, and I probably will. And hopefully continue to discover things that I just am so fascinated by, and feel like I can incorporate them in my own work in some way. It's almost like, first Takamitsu, at least as an influence for me, it's like Archipelago S is the piece that like always reminds me and keeps giving back to me, sort of like because I invested it so much into him and into his output and his music as a whole. That one piece like always comes back and influences me in a really good way, and I'm so thankful for that feeling.
And I do feel like the best music is music that every time you listen to it, you hear something new inside of it. I mean, that's like any piece I were to describe as like my favorite piece or my favorite album or song or whatever. It's like it's because I can listen to it for the rest of my life and like hear new things in it somehow. So earlier you said something that really stuck with me, and it's kind of like been this thread through the conversation actually about reminding students and yourself to enjoy what they're doing. And we've talked a lot about this, and so I realized that I don't want to get into redundancy here about this, but do you think that having that sense of joy changes the kind of music that we make?
I feel like it not only I'm thinking not only could it change the actual output of whatever you're creating or presenting, but at the very least, it could and hopefully should change the process that people are sort of navigating or finding themselves navigating when they're grappling with the various hurdles that competition sort of entails. And I think especially nowadays, with various sort of emotional highs and sort of issues um, with regard to so many different things in life right now, throughout the ages, with no matter how old you are, how young you are, trying to find sort of positivity and optimism in an area which you're very much invested in, and very much sort of like kind of championing as like you, right? It's again, for me, it feels just like almost necessary to say, ensure there is some aspect of enthusiasm or some element of fun with this, because in a way, you're creating a response to the world around you, and a response based on what you're sort of filtering through yourself. And again, that's not to say that an element of fun has to kind of like take away from a context which could be more important, but it's a matter of reminding yourself that what you're doing is essentially a result of much investment and perhaps trauma, and perhaps melancholy or sadness or happiness, whatever it is. I mean, it's an emotional response to many different things in many different contexts. And as long as there's like an element of fun with that context, hopefully it makes it feel like the action is less daunting and worrisome than perhaps what it might seem in context. And again, that can mean many different things for many different people, but I like to at least remind those that I'm working with to just not lose sight of the sort of fun about what's going on here, even if the context may not seem fun, at least initially, or the process certainly might not seem fun at all times, because frankly, it can't always. Again, there's always hurdles and headaches and whatever it could be that comes into play, But by the end of it, the fun should be there. And actually, I didn't really touch upon this, and I certainly should have, but embodying fun or enthusiasm in your work certainly reflects positively with your performers as well.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
We haven't really talked about the sort of performer connection with composers, and maybe we don't have to, because hopefully it's obvious to everybody that you should love and respect and help teach your performers, and vice versa, all the time. But I've discovered that, thankfully, that with the more fun that I have, and the more fun that I sort of like embody and present myself with regard to my music or myself, that reflection is immediately received by performers, and even just like other students or fellow composers, whoever it is, others around you will sort of react and respond to this also. But I think, especially for performers and conductors, it's very valuable that you know what you're doing, that you're confident in what you're doing, and again that there is like an element of fun with what you've done. It doesn't feel right to have worked so hard on a piece and you give it to an ensemble and like you like look like you don't really care, or that you're not excited about, like, again, for me it's strange to not feel like there's an enthusiasm based on the connection being made there. It could be because I'm simply just one who loves music for its interaction and an interconnectivity between people, like many different types of people and groups of people. But that for me for sure was a reminder to say like I should have fun with this, and that way when I present to others, they'll see that I have had fun with this, and hopefully they'll have fun putting it together and investing their energy and time into this, because frankly performers do also invest countless hours
Oh yeah.
into what we create as a whole. You know what I mean? It's the least we could do, is to make sure that we're enjoying and enthused about our work.
Absolutely, 100%. And I think you touch on something very important where, just being online and seeing people on social media and being connected with a lot of composers that way, sometimes I'll find myself thinking like, man, that person like they take themselves like way too seriously or their work too seriously. And when I say that, I don't mean like, of course, like you can create serious work, as you pointed out. Like it can be like music about, loss or grief or melancholy or, some serious subject matter in our world. But what I mean is like, at the end of the day, it's like music. It's just art. We don't have to, we're not, I mean, we can maybe save the world to a certain degree, but at the end of the day, it's like I don't think we need to take it so seriously that I'm a capital C composer walking into the room and bow down to me. Sometimes people feel a bit like that.
It's true. Yeah, I never want to feel like I'm this sort of composer element on a pedestal. Like you are all beneath me. Like I have never carried myself like that, and it's certainly not recently. And I refuse to try to even remotely seem that way, because it's not real. You know what I mean? Like I'm like a real person with feelings, and I love things to do which are not music, like video games and cooking. Like I'd rather have that kind of connection be kind of like the start of a relationship with a
Hmm.
performer or conductor or fellow composer, whoever it is. And if that sort of emerges through my work as well, that again, that enjoyment element, then again, I feel like it's more real. And I appreciate that. I appreciate the real connections in life, and especially in music, as opposed to with ones where I'm like, oh, bow down to you, pedestal sort of thing. It's just, I don't think it's worth it or that interesting, frankly.
Yeah, true. So you've touched a lot on your teaching at Oberlin and kind of how that impacts your life and what it means to you. Do you think that teaching has shaped how you think about your own compositional voice in any way, or even how you talk to yourself when you're stuck in the middle of a piece?
100%. I feel like I've learned like the same amount that I learned like throughout school, like actually being a student, as I have like teaching these past 4 years. I mean, everybody says it all the time that like students help you learn about yourself and will keep you in check, and it's so true. It's so unbelievably true. Me having to be prepared to help guide somebody through this journey is. It could be daunting and scary. For me, it's not really scary anymore, at least, because I feel like I feel very grateful and proud that I can do so. But it's impossible not to let it also influence the way I think about my own work and what I'm doing. If I'm gonna spend time in a lesson talking about how to sort of like construct a harmonic cycle which makes sense, or how to, riff on a melody, it's like, well, let me make sure I'm also doing this sort of thing too. Because hey, it's actually kind of a
Yeah.
good idea. Like, am I doing this enough in my own work? Is there a place for it? Sometimes not always. There's not. There's always a place and time and a context for these sorts of things. But at the very least, the elements that I navigate with my teaching are things that I like to kind of embody for myself, at least regularly, or at least whenever it arises in context, depending on whatever I'm working on or what have you. But certainly I'm not like a separate teacher than I am a composer. It's like, for me, it's like the same. It's very much connected in the exact same vein. Because again, to me, that just makes sense. Like, I want to teach people how to approach music in the way that I would approach music. Like, you bring me a problem, here's how I would actually tackle it. Yeah, it's so funny how you don't really think about these things when you're a student. Like what happens when you start teaching, like what are you gonna kind of like carry and embody for your own students. But again, I'm grateful for it, because it does certainly keep me in check, and also keep me wanting to continue learning, continue growing, to make sure that I can actually continue to share this sort of knowledge and enthusiasm with others in the way I have.
Well, it goes without saying that it's like a special skill set, just like anything else. And I haven't had a whole lot of opportunity to teach. I do have a handful of previous students who have gone on to do great things. But I feel like we've mentioned Balgender plenty, the common thread between both of us, and the thing I always just kind of noticed and admired, of course, when studying with Balgender is, he does exactly what you're describing. He approaches the problems you bring him in a way that is, I think the way he would tackle the problem himself, but also more importantly, and he didn't do it in a prescriptive way. And I think that's another piece of the puzzle is, how would I tackle this problem that my students run into? But like, I also don't want to like tell them like, you have to do it this way. Right.
Oh, I agree so much. In fact, with only a few exceptions about like do it this way kind of thing, right? Like don't write upwards ascending key clicks because you're letting go of keys and like that sort of stuff. Like, yeah, don't do
sure.
that because it makes no sense.
Sure.
But no, but I totally agree that it's for me it's so limiting to say like it has to be done this way. One of the first times I ever encountered that as an actual like pedagogical approach was actually when I was at Eastman. I was doing like this kind of the community music school, like one of the summer classes on notation or whatever. And I had met like this other student who was, again, it's a high schooler, just like trying to like learn some notation stuff and write some music. It was very casual, but very, very fun student. But they had brought me a piece, and they were telling me about how their previous teacher, whether it was for, I think it was just for a couple of lessons, was so adamant about what they were doing was not correct. Like, what you're doing is wrong. It needs to be done in the vein of like Mozart. And I was just
yeah.
and I was like, this is back in 2016, whatever it was. And I was so blown away by that thought. And I was thinking like, were they serious? Like, that's really what they were teaching you? Like, to not do it because they want you to be like something else? Like, what happened to the other, like, 250 plus years between that? Like, what do you mean? So, yeah, so it's scenarios like that make me, again, further embody this idea, like you put it, to not be so prescriptive, to say like it has to be this way. Because while there could be some times where it certainly makes more sense to be one way, at the end of the day, we're still engaged with a sort of subjective, medium based, entrenched in sort of perspective and lived experience. So trying to offer advice and guidance around, again, the possibility that there might be multiple approaches is like necessary, frankly. Like, you have to actually be more open-minded what you probably think you have to be when you're teaching. Again, with some regard, sometimes you want to be more like, no, do it this way because it makes more sense, because you know better. I mean, again, that's maybe it's the parents coming through where you want to like kind of parent your students. Again, valid and fine, but yeah, I would never be someone who would say like, this is wrong objectively, do it this way, because it feels just so limiting. And by limiting it, it feels like negating also, like suddenly when I'm saying like, hey, this is wrong, don't do it. Like, again, I can't fathom being that kind of person ever. And again, I agree with you that it sinks to Belginder that it's like, it's not even part of my thought process to be that way, because he was never like that.
Yeah, I will backtrack though, fully knowing that Balgender is listening to this. He was prescriptive once in a piece of mine, probably more than once, but I was writing a Sinfionetta piece, and I had an oboe solo in the middle of it. And he looked at it and he was like, "What is this? The moment that the duck walks across the stage? Like, come on, man, don't put this in there." And I changed it to trombone because he said that. So, and it made it a better piece.
Okay, well, you see, there are some times when it makes sense. Like I said, yeah, that sounds like Belginder. He has also told me things like that and I'm like, I don't even question. Like, okay, he's right, and I'll just do it, and it ends up being correct.
That makes sense. Yeah, I see it.
Oh man.
So getting into my final series of questions, and these are questions that I ask everybody, and it's always really fascinating to see how people handle them. Starting with, what do you think you would be doing, artistically or otherwise, if it wasn't composing, if like music was completely out of the equation?
Yeah, when I was younger, and because I'm still an avid gamer, I love playing video games. My wife and I share this passion. When I was much younger, I always thought that I would be involved with video games in some way, whether it be like creating video games or like programming, whatever. I had no idea because I was younger. I was like, I love playing games, so whatever it means. At a certain point, I was like, yeah, I could see myself doing that sort of thing. As I've gotten older and become more interested in the kitchen, I actually feel like I would be really good at culinary arts. I cook all the time. I bake all the time with my wife. She also is an incredible cook, and we always like are in the kitchen together, like putting things together, and doing very complex things. It's a lot of fun for us, frankly. I love sharing food with others. It's a very strong passion of mine besides music. So I feel like if I had the chance to kind of like split my timeline, let's say like 10 years ago, and I had a chance to be like a culinary person, I might have said like, I might actually would do that and kind of have a lot of fun with it, frankly, because again, I discovered that I actually really quite love doing it, frankly, very, very strongly. Actually, we always talk about how, and we're just kind of joking around, but we're like, oh, our kids will be a chef. Like I feel like our kids are gonna be, they're not gonna be a musician or a visual, they're gonna be a chef. Like watch what
Yeah.
happens. you know, yeah, that'd be kind of cool. Make us some
Yeah.
food.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much like mainstream media now that's like, The Bear, it's like food centric and like, yeah, it's good stuff.
Totally.
What are you trying to get better at in your creative life right now?
And actually, in a very sort of objective sort of way, I'm certainly trying to get better at writing for string instruments. I'm not sure if this kind of answer you want to, like something so like literal, like this is
Oh,
very much
no, no.
practicing.
It's totally open
Um,
ended.
yeah, because it's not like I can't write for string instruments, but as a wind player and someone who's been in, as you probably can know, being in like in wind ensembles and symphonic bands. I mean, it's in marching band, like that kind of environment of music is very it's very sort of significant for my upbringing as a musician. Even in way before I even thought about being a composer, right? It's like everything I thought about was always entrenched in like the wind band repertoire or the jazz band repertoire, right? Like actual like jazz bands, playing kind of standard charts and stuff. It's like so in those contexts, whenever I was encountered with a string instrument besides double bass,
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
like, I don't know how you work or what you're doing, and I'm kind of scared of you. So I'll like not engage with that. So again, it wasn't until like college and of course beyond where I started to kind of invest more time into string writing in general. So I feel like while I'm always learning and trying new things out with basically anything that I navigate, I've tried especially hard more recently to kind of really capture more about sort of string writing and elements of string writing that makes it feel very idiomatic and sort of expressive and such. Again, not because I can't do it or because I don't have any familiarity, but it doesn't come to me as quickly as it does. Like if you told me, if you ask me about bass clarinets, like I could tell you pretty much anything. You know what I mean? Or saxophone, right? But it's like when you ask me about like the cello, I have like to really think like, okay, what can it do carefully? Like I make sure I don't do anything impossible for it. So in that regard, I like to always like make sure I focus in on these instruments and whatever I'm writing for, just kind of like make sure I'm like actually actively trying to practice and get better. I never want to just kind of give them just like long notes and like say like that's it. I want to make sure like I'm actually taking advantage of them. My most recent piece actually, that I'm just about finishing up as a commission for solo viola. It's a solo viola concerto for viola and orchestra, actually. So by necessity, I've had to kind of like really focus in on the
Yeah.
viola. Again, one of my favorite string instruments, but the way I sort of navigated it has sort of proven my practice correct. Where I'm very much like this is a viola piece. How do I navigate in that regard? Like, what am I kind of like learning as I write this? Making it educational for myself while still maintaining an air of musical and sort of personal investment and interest. Make sure it's a piece and not just like a learning tool essentially, although
Yeah.
it does both essentially.
Right, right. Yeah, I have to say that as a brass player who I love writing for strings, and it's because like logically the instruments make so much more sense than like the instruments that we play. Like of course like
Yes.
brass instruments make sense to me and I understand how they work because I've played it like my whole freaking life. Woodwinds I just write and hope for the best, I'll admit, and I've admitted that
Yeah.
publicly plenty of times, but like strings I can look at a string instrument and like I can like airplay and like it's like I can't play a violin to save my life or a cello or viola for that matter, but I can like air guitar it and kind of understand how the music might work on the hand and all that kind
For
of same
sure.
with piano. Like I would never consider myself, I'm more of a pianist of course than a violinist, but still the piano is a tool to me. But I can at least like airplay and see how it might sit. Woodwinds I'm just like just hope for the
Good luck.
best. Let me know if you have issues, we can revisit.
Yeah.
Is there a tool that you use in your practice that you think everyone should know about and that everyone else could benefit from? And this could be like a literal tool, like an object. It could
Mhm.
be process. It could be software. Anything like that.
Yeah, actually, so this is something that I adopted from my time at USF, but it's at least for me, and I never try to offer to my students as like you have to do it, but I like them to at least try, is to spend time just handwriting your work at first. I think the allure of technology nowadays, of course, is very valuable. It's so important. I mean, I could not get through a piece without my notation software, frankly. So 100% fully aware of how much I need to rely on it. But I never hop into the computer territory or the computer realm without having spent some time with my pad, with some
Yeah.
notation paper, with a pencil, with a pen, and at a piano, whatever it is, like spending time actually just like writing things down by hand and kind of just, I mean, even if it's just like small sketches, small gestures, whatever it is, spending some time actually with that part of the process with a very something very tangible in front of you. I like to remind my students that this is part of the process of internalizing what you're working with. And I always say, like, if you like, you should internalize your work so that when you are ever encountered by somebody who wants to ask you about some element of this piece, like, immediately how to point to it, how can you sing this complex rhythm, can you talk about this harmonic choice, can you sing me this melody, can you whistle, like whatever it is, all that relies on internalization. And I feel like, at least for me, the way I learn things, I internalize better when I spend time actually handwriting them. Again, and I fully acknowledge that nowadays, especially, somebody might have the exact same response, just like throwing it to a computer. That's totally fine. I'm not trying to say that you have to be one way, but there is something valuable, I think, about handwriting work before moving on into the digital realm. Of course, composers and musicians did this for centuries before us. They
Yeah.
didn't
Yeah.
need
Yeah.
computers to make great works of art, right? So that's why I say, hey, at least give it a try for this one piece. Like, just try handwriting elements of this. Not even the entire work. Some students I've had actually do handwrite their entire piece, and that actually scares me because I don't want to deal with that. I don't need to go that far for myself, at least, but again, even if it's just like one page of sort of sketch work from a day where you're at a piano, just like practicing harmony, writing some things down, I think it's very good practice. It's a good way to, again, internalize what you're working with, and it makes it feel like you're investing more time with like the material in its kind of like most purest form before it gets sort of like developed into the more complexities that it'll encounter as a piece develops, as a process develops for your composition. So sketch, handwrite, internalize. Those are my tips and tools that I always use. And then for me, it's what I like to teach my students as well.
A lot of people have answered that question with like a notation software, and you're the first person I think to answer it the opposite. And I'm totally in your camp because I think of USF. And just very quickly, I'll share this story because I know you'll get it. Up until I went to grad school at USF and studied with Balgender, I only wrote in the finale. I never wrote by hand. And then the very first day of class, we did group composition lessons as a grad students, and our first assignment was write a short piece for up to 3 instruments, 2 to 3 minute piece for 1 to 3 instruments. Bring it in next week by hand. And I don't know if there was like something that got lost in like communication, or you're always nervous like first day of class in a new place. And we all came back like with handwritten scores. And Balgender was like, "Why'd you guys do this?" But that was like my first experience. Like I spent the whole week like carefully handwriting like an entire piece of music. And it just like changed my life, literally. Like I've never looked back. And I do find that like as soon as I start notating it into a software, which is now like I've had to learn Dorico lately because Finale is not being developed anymore, which I've spent way too much time on this podcast talking about with people. But at any rate, as soon as it doesn't matter the software, as soon as I start putting my handwritten material in, it's just limitations start taking over. It's like, and so I do think as the most time I can spend, as time allows with deadlines and whatnot, the more time I can spend writing by hand, I feel like the closer the piece is, like you said, in its purest form, that before it starts getting like mucked with in some way.
First of all, as a Finale user, I feel your pain. So we won't talk about it because I'm
Yep.
sure we can get to the same points, but I'm with you. But yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think the limitations also exist actually with what MIDI can do to you negatively. I think the detrimental effect of relying so much on MIDI playback has the exact same effect, and that's also why I say, like, try to internalize this for yourself before getting to that point. Because if you're so used to just hitting play on your computer and listening back to what the MIDI is trying to tell you, or relay to you, then it quickly becomes like your inner ear, which is then also not correct. Like, sure, like you'll get like the pitch content correct, but even then, like, you're missing sort of the nuance of timbre, the complete nuance of personality of players
Mm-hmm.
doing whatever, the temperature of the environment, the space it's being played in. I mean, there's so many elements that MIDI does not account for in an effort to kind of give you like a perfected or like a objective representation of your music. And again, I find that just making sure that you don't rely so much on that element is so valuable for not sort of tainting the inner ear to think that, oh, that's what it'll actually sound like. Questions of balance also come through for me, at least the most when I bring this up to my students. When they're writing like orchestral works, I say like don't rely on the MIDI for this, especially because it's so easy to kind of on your digital mixer to boost the flute in its low end because you'll think you'll hear it. Now it's like don't do that because it's not going to work. So yeah, I totally agree with you. It's remarkably valuable, and I do hope that people will at least give it a try, at least initially, to see kind of like what happens for part of the process with that as a sort of starting point.
Yeah, for sure. It's almost like we study with at least some of the same people.
Yes, imagine that.
So my final question, and maybe you've already answered it, but either way, I'm always curious to hear what people say to this. What is something that you've never had a chance to say about your art that you've always wanted to share with people?
I feel like I say this or allude to this sometimes in context, but one of the most important elements of my development in the last almost 10 years is actually having met my wife, because actually every single piece that I've written since meeting her in some regard has kind of like come from her direction in some sort of way, whether it's just like very simple inspiration or her presence or her sort of impact on my life in general. Every like nuance of my creative output since 2015 essentially, or since late 2015, has been actually with regards to her presence in my life. And it's something that I don't bring up too often because, at the layers in which things sort of develop in my creative output and my inspiration eventually circle around things like birdsong, again, types of music, etc. But the reality is actually like the starting point, the impetus for everything always actually comes from my wife, which is very, I think, for me, fascinating. And it's interesting to think about. For example, when I mentioned birdsong earlier and I mentioned how my wife and I love birds, like that's one of the reasons why I started going that direction, like sort of very sort of full speed ahead, that the orchestra piece we talked about earlier with the jazz combo and orchestra, La Flor Nopal, the idea of the piece beginning in the desert was related to her because she's from Phoenix, Arizona, surrounded by desert and such, right? So that checks out there. One of the earliest pieces that I remember, that I think the first piece I did was one for solo viola and piano, so a viola and piano, called Huachactun, which is a sort of religious site in Guatemala. It was a Mayan sort of religious site, no longer there, of course, besides being for sort of tourists and such. But my wife has a Guatemalan heritage. Her family's from Guatemala. So even that has been kind of like a direct sort of response or reaction to sort of influencing my work. So every piece, essentially, I can always point to saying like, yes, my wife has had some kind of influence or manifestation of something within part of the process, even though it might not be the most transient, like La Flor Nopal, which is a piece I actually wrote for her. But even in the most sort of simplest regards, like it does always come back to her, which I find nothing, at least for me, nothing is more sincere or real or significant as kind of acknowledging that this one person has had that much of an impact on my life and my creative process. Again, even if it doesn't seem that way, or if I don't talk about it, or if I don't remind her. I mean, she knows this, I'm pretty sure, because she's very quick to kind of like catch my inspiration from the get-go. But yeah, it's something very important for me to kind of acknowledge the fact that, again, a personal connection makes my art feel more worthwhile and valuable, at least for myself, if nothing else.
Yeah, for sure. And a lovely way to cap off this conversation. Michael, man, first of all, we probably shouldn't wait as long as we did to catch up again for next time. But second of all, this has been so awesome. And thank you so much for your time today.
Tyler, thank you again so much for having me do this. I think this is the first time I've ever done like a podcast like this, but it's been such a fun conversation, not only with reminiscing, but also really thinking more about sort of what I'm doing as a composer and a musician. And it's been an absolute pleasure. And I really appreciate you taking the time to bring me on here and having this chat with you. It's been awesome.
So great to catch up with Michael, and many thanks to him for sharing his story, not just about the music itself, but about how identity and personal history have shaped his work in really powerful ways. You can learn more about Michael Frazier and his music online. I will include a link to his website in the show notes. I'm Tyler Kline. Thank you once again, as always, for joining me for this episode of Music Maker. The show is produced by Loose Leaf Transmissions, made for all ears. And you can explore more episodes and find ways to support the work at looseleaftransmissions.com. Thank you so much again for listening. I will see you back here next time. Bye for now.